In order for us to understand the age of Renaissance, it is very important to look at the causes that gave rise to it, right? So do you remember that the Muslims and the Christians came face to face in a particular religious war? Now this religious war was known as the Crusades. Now this war was the holy war that was fought between the Muslim Turks and the Christians to gain the holy land, Jerusalem. Now it was not only Jerusalem that they were fighting for, they were also fighting for places like Antioch and Anatolia, right? That was very important for the Christians. Now if you take a look at this particular picture, you see that here Muslim camps are located outside the Roman city. And here you can see that the Christian and the Islamic forces are fighting outside the city of Italy. So whenever we talk about the Crusades in history, it is often seen through a very negative light, right? But Crusades also has a very important role to play when it comes to the advent of Renaissance. Why so? The major reason being that it established, or rather re-established, the contacts between the Islamic and the Christian worlds, primarily, through the revival of trade. Now, how trade? Because when the Roman Empire was split into Western and Eastern, trade routes were cut for the western side of the empire after the 4th century AD. Now, when Crusades happened, these routes opened up and the forces were coming in, and there was a sort of intermixture that happened, and that opened up the trade for them. Now, along with the trade, there was also, the flow of goods, ideologies, and various ideas that came from the east to the west. Now, who were bringing these ideas or ideologies to the West? It was the artists and the scholars who were being patronized in the Western Europe. Scholars like Aristotle and Plato were being, they were migrating to the Western Roman Empire, and they were establishing their various ideals, right? Various ideas, and they were being accepted in the West. So now this migration not only, caused the people to come and settle down in various places, but they were also bringing their culture, their ideas, and they were settling down in new places, right? Now this entirely happened because there was a growth in economic relations, which was due to the trade, as we saw, and this culture, this renewed idea of culture was reflected in the age of Renaissance. After the Crusades, what happened was the Ottoman Turks who came face to face with the Byzantine Empire, they were trying to encroach upon that area. So they were moving in, and after a point of time, the main city, that was the capital city called Constantinople, fell around 1453 AD, right? So the fall of Constantinople therefore becomes another major factor or another major cause for the rise of Renaissance. And why so? Because these, migrations that were happening were essentially because of the factors like the Crusades, like the wars, like the fall of a major capital. So what happened was these scholars, these Greek, Arab, Roman scholars were coming from the Eastern Roman Empire to the Western Roman Empire. Now, the interesting fact here is that they essentially were located in Italy. So they were particularly settling down in Italy. Now, when these people are, of course, coming in and settling in new places, they were bringing with them their knowledge as well as their manuscripts, their ideas. Now, this gave rise to an intellectual flow, to, an environment of knowledge that ultimately was showcased in the age of Renaissance as well. But why were these, scholars essentially coming in from the Eastern and Western Roman Empire? And why essentially, was this the point of time when their ideas were being accepted or were being propagated in the Renaissance? That was because, at this point of time when they were situated in Eastern Roman Empire, the Orthodox Church had an immense amount of dominance, right? And they weren't being able to speak their mind. Once they moved to the Western Roman Empire and they started sort of garnering the individualistic sense, the intellectual environment therefore developed. And the important point to note here is that all this was happening in the city of Italy in particular. If you remember that we have already studied about the rise of feudalism and the feudal structure, where the kings were placed in the highest order of the hierarchy and the peasants were in the lowest, right? Now, this entire hierarchy or this entire structure was essentially linked to the land, right? Where there was a lord relationship that was developed. Okay, so this entire factor of exploiting the peasants created a very divided society. This enslavement in the feudal system was what created this particular divided society. After a point of time then, due to this trade that we discussed, there were various new towns that were developing, right? And these new towns saw, the rise of few new sort of occupation and people in occupation, like that of the merchants and the bankers. So these serfs who were essentially being exploited in a feudal system, who were being enslaved in a feudal system, they found these new towns very lucrative. So in order to find new opportunities, they were migrating to the new cities. So what essentially happened here was that from an agriculturally based society, the entire focus was shifting to trade, because they were looking for a second sort of opportunity in the cities. The feudalistic society was highly exploitative and treated the peasants and serfs harshly. So we see that the peasants and the serfs, they are moving to the cities to find alternative sources of income, and thus we see that there is a lack of labor to work on the agricultural fields, that is finally leading to the decline of feudalism. So basically the lack of labor led to the decline of feudalism. Now, when these people are moving to the cities, they are automatically turning to secondary occupations like that of trade, that is gaining importance at this point of time. So we see that abundance of labor in the cities shifted the focus to secondary occupations like that of trade, and also gave them better ways of living. Now, all these migrations that were happening, they also included, not only these serfs and like we discussed, they also included the scholars, right? Like Aristotle, Plato, but there were other scholars as well, right? There was Cardinal Bessarion, there was John Argyropoulos, and there was also Demetrius Chokokondylis, right? So these were all, Greek scholars, and essentially they also became, the people who carried the ideas, the intellectual flow and knowledge when they were migrating. So where were these people migrating? They were migrating to Italy. So now we see that Italy becomes the hub where people from various areas were coming in and exchanging ideas. Thus, Italy becomes the first region to experience the forces of Renaissance. Can you answer then? Which place was the first to experience Renaissance? Was it Egypt, was it Italy, or was it Greece? That's right, it was Italy. So now, all these factors that we have discussed about, for example, the Crusades, the scholars migrating, the thriving trade, all of this fueled the economic prosperity in these areas. Now, not only did it fuel the economic prosperity, but there was a sort of spirit that developed in the people, right? Now, this spirit was the spirit of inquiry. Now, how would people then, start to question or start to understand which idea to accept and which idea, was wrong for them, right? So, the people started to read and ask questions to each other and also to dominant factors like the church, right? And they were now conscious and they were focused on the well-being and interest of themselves, right? We have already studied about individualism. So this sort of, factors was the reason why the focus shifted from God to the individual self. Now, this spirit of inquiry that we are talking about, essentially, looked at the factor that happiness could also be received without, God advocating it, or God being the middleman, or church, in fact, being the advocate of this happiness, right? There were, people who were questioning this institution of church. People like Roger Bacon, like Thomas Aquinas, like Peter Abelard were the ones who questioned the church, the institution that was in the highest level of hierarchy. So now, how would these people therefore come to know about what is right and what is wrong if they do not know about what the institution of church deals with, right? So that factor developed from reading, right? But how would they read in that age? So if your answer is the invention of printing press, then you're absolutely right. The invention of printing press gave the people the accessibility to read. Now, reading became accessible to masses, and this habit of reading, or this idea of reading, developed the sense of individuality in them and also developed self-consciousness. How so? Because when they were reading about the church, when they were reading the Bible, they were being able to understand what the Bible actually states, right? But do you know who exactly invented this printing press? So Johannes Gutenberg, a man who was born in Germany in the city of Mainz, came up with this idea of a mechanical, movable type of printing press. So essentially, his methods used a movable type, right, with certain blocks made of iron that used oil ink, and that was used to mechanically print on papers, right? So the invention happened in 1439, right? And Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized this entire, idea of publishing. So there was a spark, it was a revolution that something like a printing press could be created, right? So essentially, one of the, hits that Johannes Gutenberg created was his 42-line Bible. Now, what is a 42-line Bible? A 42-line Bible is basically a Bible in which each page would have 42 lines written in it. Now, this 42-line Bible was much cheaper than the handwritten Bible, and thus it was easily available to people. This 42-line Bible was printed in 1455, after which the entire industry of publishing was created in Europe. To know more about the story of Johannes Gutenberg, you can click on the link for the iDictionary feature. So as you saw, that this, easy access to knowledge, to intellect, was what created this surge, this idea that, people could understand and consciously decide of what was right and what was wrong. So the printing press essentially revolutionized the factor of knowledge. So as we saw, the factors, for example, the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople, the decline of feudalism, and the invention of printing press essentially paved the path for the age of Renaissance.